What's up guys, so quite soon we will have Dr.Ratio dropping in game and I just want to go through his kit, especially since he will be free for everyone to pick up, so knowing what he does would be beneficial for every player. Before we get into that, please subscribe to the channel for more Honkai content and drop a like if you enjoyed this video. Okay, Dr.Ratio. Glancing at his overview, Dr.Ratio is a DPS character that deals follow-up attacks after he or his allies attack. He can increase his crit rate and crit damage depending on how many debuffs his enemies have. Okay, immediately I'm thinking of who he would have great synergy with. The first would be Topaz, considering the fact that she enhances damage dealt by follow-up attacks by applying a debuff on enemies. So the debuff would also increase Dr.Ratio's crit rate and damage, so Topaz seems like a great option to pair up with Dr.Ratio. If you also have Ruan Mei on the team, which makes running two DPS characters more viable, that would be a strong team to run. The second character, which could be a bit of a stretch, is Kafka and just Nihility characters in general, to be honest, simply due to the fact that the more debuffs applied on enemies, the more of an increase in Dr.Ratio's crit rate and crit damage. And coincidentally, Kafka is out along with Dr.Ratio, so if they sync well in the team, it might be another upside to pull for Kafka. Okay, moving on to the traces now. The first being when Dr.Ratio uses a skill, for every debuff the target has, his crit rate and crit damage increases. This effect can stack up to a certain limit. Of course, there will be a limit to the crit rate and crit damage stacks, which we won't know exactly till he drops in game. So again, Nihility characters being paired with Dr.Ratio might be great just due to how many debuffs can be applied by them. The second trace is when the skill is used to attack a target, there is a chance to reduce the attack target enemy's effect res for a certain number of turns. Okay, so now this further supports Dr.Ratio wanting to be with Nihility characters, as they would also benefit. With Kafka applying shock, there is of course a chance enemies shake that debuff off due to their effect res being high enough. That is why you would want some effect hit rate on Kafka to make sure she can apply shock. Now that Dr.Ratio can also reduce effect res on enemies, this just increases the chances of enemies being debuffed, which is great for Nihility characters. The final trace, when dealing damage to a target that has a certain number of debuffs or more, for each debuff the target has, the damage dealt by Dr.Ratio to this target increases up to a maximum increase value. Okay, so from the traces we can pretty much tell that Dr.Ratio needs to be with some debuffers in order to maximize the damage potential. So this is looking really nice for Kafka mains like myself, and there is some potential for some synergy here. Okay, now the juicier aspects of the kit. Starting with the technique. Creates a dimension that taunts nearby enemies, lasting for a certain number of seconds. After entering battle with enemies in this dimension, there is a chance to reduce each enemy's target speed for a number of turns. Only one dimension created by allies can exist at the same time. Okay, so now this seems interesting. If that speed reduction on all enemies can be considered as a debuff, maybe Dr.Ratio doesn't have to rely on characters debuffing for him as much. He might be better partnered with Topaz to get the most out of his damage potential, as his follow-up attacks could deal some insane numbers to just blitz through the waves quite quickly. Also, speed reduction on enemies is just great in general, as this would allow you to get in some turns with your DPS characters to really cut enemies down quick, especially if you have stacked your DPS characters with quite a bit of speed. Moving on to the skill. Now, the way the game has been progressing, character kits have been becoming more fancier and more technical. So it's surprising to see that Dr.Ratio's skill is simply dealing imaginary damage to a single enemy. However now, his talent is linked with his skill. When using the skill, there is a fixed chance of launching a follow-up attack for one time, dealing imaginary damage. For each debuff the enemy target has, the fixed chance of launching follow-up attacks increases. If the target is defeated before the follow-up attack triggers, the follow-up attack will be directed at a single random enemy instead. Now, the more I delve into this kit, it just seems more and more vital how prominent debuffs will be, as if that follow-up attack does some really good damage, you really need to make sure it goes off, and you will need some enemies debuff for sure for that to happen. The fact that the follow-up attack will be directed to another enemy if the one already selected has been defeated, makes it seem like you don't want to miss out on dealing this follow-up attack, since it'll probably do some really good damage. Also, I'm pretty happy with that, since it is quite annoying when playing with Kafka how follow-up attack doesn't go off if the enemy has already been defeated, so it's just a bit of a waste in her kit. As good as that talent is, I really don't see why this couldn't have been the skill instead. Then he would have had another ability for his talent. It just seems like a waste of space in the kit design, as he could have been able to do more with his talent then. Like, have you seen Ruan Mei? Her kit is literally endless in the amount of things she does. Also, they surely did not plan to release Dr.Ratio for free, so the fact that you may have had to summon for this character when his skill technically does nothing but single target imaginary damage is crazy, so thankfully he is free. Now finally, the ultimate. Deals imaginary damage to a single enemy target and applies Wise Man's Folly. When Dr.Ratio's allies attack a target afflicted with Wise Man's Folly, Dr.Ratio launches one follow-up attack on his target. Wise Man's Folly can be triggered up to a certain number of times and only affects the most recent target of Dr.Ratio's ultimate. This trigger count resets after Dr.Ratio's ultimate is used. Now this ultimate straight away I'd say is amazing against bosses. If Dr.Ratio deals a huge chunk of damage to the boss, and then every time an ally attacks the boss, Dr.Ratio launches a follow-up attack, he will be ripping through the boss very quickly. Given that follow-up attacks will seem the most important aspect of Dr.Ratio's kit, he would definitely be dealing some great numbers with them, so this ult seems promising. However now, if you use this ultimate on any other enemy than the boss, it would be a great waste since Dr.Ratio only deals follow-up attacks to the one he uses the ultimate on. And if he doesn't one-shot everyone else apart from the boss, it would be surprising. So using the ultimate on smaller mobs, it's just a one-shot on them and no other effect, which is pretty dull. But then on bosses, it has some great value as you constantly launch follow-up attacks. Overall, the kit looks good, really can't complain about him since we are getting him for free. I would say it is a bit strange how they designed the skill and talent as they are literally tied in. His talent could have been a lot better by doing more if the skill does what the talent does, but it is what it is. He is free at the end of the day, so not that big of a deal. In terms of how to build Dr.Ratio, given that follow-up attacks seem to be the core of his kit, I'd like to believe the Ash Blazing Grand Duke set would definitely be great for him. The 2-piece being a 20% damage increase in follow-up attacks, and the 4-piece will increase his attack by 6% every time his follow-up attack deals damage, which stacks up to 8 times. So in a situation where you can use his ultimate on the boss and you launch quite a few follow-up attacks, his attack can jump significantly and it will last for 3 turns, which is pretty nice. You can definitely just run the 2-piece for the set if you'd like. The 20% increase in follow-up attack damage is valuable enough, and you could pair this up with the 2-piece that increases imaginary damage by 10%. The imaginary set seems like a great fit also for Dr.Ratio, as the 4-piece would be, when attacking debuffed enemies, the wearer's crit rate increases by 10% and the crit damage increases by 20% against imprisoned enemies. So of course you would likely be attacking debuffed enemies most of the time, so you can have a nice boost of crit rate which syncs well with the kit as he will be a crit based character and then deals more damage against imprisoned enemies on top. So yeah, either of these sets would be great in my opinion, just whichever you have the best stats on, and you would likely want the most crit rate and crit damage like most DPS characters. Just going over his icon now. It increases the wearer's crit damage by 20%. For every debuff on the enemy target, the wearer's crit damage dealt against this target increases by 8%, stacking up to 3 times. When using the ultimate to attack the enemy target, the wearer receives the disputation effect, which increases damage dealt by 36% and enables their follow-up attacks to ignore 24% of the target's defense. This effect lasts for 2 turns. Okay, so as expected, the signature light cone would be the best in slot for Dr.Ratio. Standard 20% increase in crit damage, and it could go up to 44% against debuffed enemies, and his ultimate is just going to deal a ton more damage, especially with follow-up attacks ignoring defense. Dr.Ratio has some crazy potential with his light cone to be an insane boss killer. The second part to his light cone becomes void if you nuke a smaller enemy, so it's just like he was designed to be a boss killer. As always, signature light cones are not a must. However, since we don't need to pull for Dr.Ratio, you could try for his light cone since we have more jades, but completely up to you guys. Of course, there are other options such as the simulated universe light cone cruising in the Stellar Sea, and it's pretty easy to superimpose to 5 since it is free. At S5 you would gain a 16% crit rate increase and an additional 16% bringing up to 32% if enemies have less than 50% HP, along with a 40% attack increase when you defeat an enemy for 2 turns. There is also Yang Jing's light cone if you've pulled, that offers more base crit damage being 30%, and if you don't crit an enemy, you gain an increase of 36% in crit rate for a turn. So yeah, some pretty good options for light cones, so don't feel forced to summon for the signature. Overall, I am pretty excited for the release, more so because Dr.Ratio will be free, but he actually is looking to be a great boss killer and will be a great addition to players' accounts since he is imaginary, and there are not that many imaginary DPS characters. Well, that wraps it up for Dr.Ratio. If you guys did enjoy the video, please subscribe to the channel for more Honkai content from myself and drop a like. Also, drop a comment on your thoughts on Dr.Ratio. And yeah, hope to catch you guys later.